Ring around the Rosie, pocket full of posies, ashes, we all fall down. You've sung this nursery rhyme since childhood, skipping rope in schoolyards, innocent and carefree. But what if I told you that these seemingly harmless words encode one of the most terrifying experiences in human history? A plague so devastating it could kill you in hours. A city so consumed by paranoia that authorities would nail wooden boards across your door and leave your entire family to die inside. The year is 1665. London is about to descend into hell. Not the metaphorical kind we casually reference, but a literal. Waking nightmare where the streets overflow with corpses, where neighbors inform on neighbors, where the very air seems poisoned with death. Within months, nearly a quarter of the city's population will be gone. But the truly horrifying part isn't just the death toll, it's what this plague did to the human soul. How quickly the thin veneer of civilization cracked to reveal the raw terror beneath. You'd think you'd survive? You'd think your modern sensibilities, your knowledge of hygiene, your rationality would save you? Let me take you back. Let me show you what it was really like to wake up in plague-ridden London, where every cough from your child could mean a death sentence. Where a red cross painted on your door transformed your home into a tomb, and where the only question wasn't if the plague would reach you, but when. This isn't a story about statistics or historical dates. This is about what happens to ordinary people, mothers, fathers, children, shopkeepers, servants, when an invisible enemy tears apart everything they know. This is about the baker who watched his entire family die over the course of a week. The nurse who inspected corpses for a few pennies. The wealthy merchant who fled to the countryside, leaving his servants locked inside an infected house. By the end, you'll understand why the Great Plague of 1665 represents more than just a medical catastrophe. It reveals something fundamental about human nature when confronted with our own mortality, and it's not always pretty. The plague didn't arrive all at once like a thunderclap. It crept into London gradually, insidiously. During the unseasonably warm spring of 1665, the first cases appeared in the filthy, overcrowded parish of St. Giles-in-the-Fields, in a ramshackle cottage on the western edge of the city. 2 people died. The authorities marked it down as spotted fever, because acknowledging the truth that the plague had returned would have been economically and socially catastrophic. But denial can only last so long. Within weeks, more bodies appeared, then dozens, then hundreds. By summer, when the heat transformed, London's open sewers into festering rivers of waste and the smell of death hung thick in every alleyway. There was no hiding it anymore. The plague was here, and it was hungry. To understand the sheer terror this inspired, you need to grasp that Londoners had living memory of what plague meant. The Black Death of 1348 had wiped out half of Europe. Smaller outbreaks had visited England repeatedly over the centuries. Everyone knew someone whose grandparents had lived through an outbreak. The plague wasn't an abstract historical curiosity, it was the monster under the bed, the nightmare that could return at any moment, and now it had. The disease itself was brutal in its efficiency. Might wake up feeling fine. Perhaps notice a headache, maybe some fatigue. By afternoon, you'd develop a fever. By evening, the telltale signs would appear. Dark swellings called buboes in your groin, armpits or neck, painful lumps that could grow to the size of an apple. Your skin might develop dark spots, the Rosie of the nursery rhyme that looked like purple-black bruises. Some victims became delirious, tearing off their clothes and running naked through the streets, screaming about demons. Others simply lay down and never rose again. The speed was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. You could be haggling over the price of bread in the morning and dead by sunset. Families went to bed healthy and woke to find a child covered in buboes, burning with fever, crying out in pain. And once the plague entered your house, it rarely left anyone behind. London's official response was rooted in a combination of medieval superstition and emerging medical theory. The authorities believed the plague spread through miasma, corrupted air that carried disease. This led to some measures that were accidentally effective, like burning barrels of sulfur in the streets and ordering households to keep fires burning constantly to purify the air. But it also led to disaster. The most infamous policy was the quarantine order. If anyone in your household showed plague symptoms, a municipal official would paint a red cross on your door roughly a foot tall, along with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Guards would be posted outside, often rough men hired from the lower classes. Sometimes criminals themselves, and you would be locked inside. Not just the sick person, everyone. your healthy children, your elderly parents, your servants. For 40 days, you would remain sealed in that house with the dying and the dead. Imagine it. Your daughter wakes up with a fever. You try to hide it, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, praying it's just a summer illness. But the telltale swellings appear. Neighbor notices, perhaps. Or one of the official searchers comes calling elderly women paid a pittance to inspect bodies and report plague cases. The verdict is rendered. That afternoon, workmen arrive with hammers and nails. The Red Cross goes up. Guards take their positions. Your door is now your prison wall. Inside, you watch your daughter deteriorate. She cries out for water, for relief from the pain. The buboes turn black. She becomes delirious. Perhaps she dies after 3 days, perhaps after a week, but her body remains in the house with you. The searchers won't come to remove it immediately. There are too many bodies, too few carts. So you live with her corpse, watching it decay in the summer heat, breathing the same air, wondering when the fever will take you too. This was the reality that transformed London into a city of the damned. And we haven't even gotten to the worst parts yet. Let's walk through a day in plague-ridden London, starting at dawn. The first thing that would assault you is the smell. Open your window if you Durand, the stench would roll in like a physical thing. Human waste from overflowing cesspits. Rotting garbage piled in every alley. The sweet, sick odor of decomposition from houses where bodies lay unburied. Add to this the acrid smoke from fires burning constantly in the streets. And you'd understand why many Londoners stuffed their nostrils with herbs or held pomanders filled with spices to their faces whenever they ventured outside. The streets themselves looked apocalyptic. Grass grew between the cobblestones because there was barely any traffic. Shops stood shuttered, their owners either dead, fled, or too terrified to open for business. Every few houses you'd see the Red Cross, some freshly painted, others faded and weathered from weeks of quarantine. From behind those marked doors, you might hear weeping, or worse, the raving of someone in the grip of plague delirium, shrieking about visions of hell. The few people who did venture out moved like ghosts, pressing themselves against walls to avoid any contact with others. They carried flowers or herbs, the posies of the rhyme, believing these might ward off the poisoned air. Many smoked tobacco constantly, convinced it purified their lungs. One contemporary observer noted that even children as young as 7 or 8 could be seen puffing on pipes, urged on by terrified parents who believed it might save them. The irony of children smoking for their health would be amusing if the context weren't so grim. But let's focus on specific people, because that's where the real horror lives. Take Margaret, a washerwoman in her 30s, who lived in Cheapside with her husband Thomas, a printer, and their 3 children. In early July, their neighbor's house received the Red Cross. Margaret watched from her window as the family's servants were locked inside with their dying master. She heard their screams, their pleas to be released. She listened as those screams gradually fell silent over the course of 2 weeks. Margaret became obsessed with prevention. She scrubbed her doorstep with vinegar every morning. She made her children hold sulfur tablets in their mouths, a folk remedy that left their tongues yellow and made them retch. She refused to let them play outside, keeping them imprisoned in their own home voluntarily. Hoping to avoid the involuntary imprisonment of the Red Cross, every evening Thomas would return from the printing house still operating because someone needed to print the weekly bills of mortality. The grim accounting of death's hand Margaret would make him strip naked in the doorway and wash himself with harsh soap before entering. Her paranoia was not unusual. It was survival. But it created a psychological prison as real as the physical ones. The constant vigilance, the inspection of every family member's neck and armpits for swellings, the terror that accompanied every cough or complaint of feeling tired, this wore people down in ways that are hard to fully articulate. Some Londoners cracked under the strain, developing what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders or paranoia. Others became numb, adopting a fatalistic attitude. If the plague wanted them, it would take them, so why bother fighting? The city's infrastructure began to collapse under the weight of death. The usual burial practices became impossible. Normally, bodies would be washed, dressed in shrouds, and buried in church graveyards with proper religious rites. But by August, people were dying faster than gravediggers could dig. The solution was the plague, massive communal graves dug on the outskirts of the city. These pits were horrifying to witness. Imagine a crater, perhaps 40 feet long and 20 feet deep, and into this hole, night after night, the dead carts would come, The dead carts made their rounds after dark, announced by a bell and the cry of "Bring out your dead." The carters, usually criminals or the desperately poor, the only ones willing to take such work, would pile bodies onto their carts like cordwood. No ceremony, no dignity. A wealthy merchant might be thrown in alongside a beggar, a child's small corpse wedged between two adults. When the cart was full, it would proceed to the plague pit. At the pit's edge, the bodies would simply be tipped in, tumbling down to land in whatever position gravity determined. Sometimes the bodies were sprinkled with quicklime to hasten decomposition. Sometimes not. There wasn't always enough lime. Then dirt would be shoveled in, just enough to cover them, before the next load arrived. One contemporary writer describes seeing a woman's hand protruding from the dirt in one of these pits, her fingers still clutching at the air as if trying to claw her way back to life. But perhaps nothing reveals the psychological devastation more than what happened to trust and social bonds. The plague transformed neighbors into potential executioners. If you suspected someone in the next house had plague, you could report them to the authorities, and they would be locked up. Some people did this out of genuine concern for public health. Others did it out of spite, settling old grudges or eliminating business competitors. The system was ripe for abuse. Then there were the searchers, elderly women, often widows, hired by the parishes to inspect bodies and determine cause of death. These women occupied a strange social position. They were essential to the authorities' response, yet they were also feared and sometimes despised. They would enter plague houses to examine corpses, prodding the dead flesh looking for buboes, then report their findings to the parish clerk. For this grim work, they received perhaps a few shillings a week, and whatever they could pilfer from the homes they entered. Some searchers were honest, others were not. A wealthy family might bribe a searcher to report that their loved one had died of spotted fever or consumption, rather than plague, thus avoiding the Red Cross and quarantine. Or a searcher, knowing her power, might demand payment to render a favorable verdict. One contemporary complained that searchers were often drunk, their judgments unreliable, their integrity questionable. But who else would do such work? The wealthy, of course, fled. They had that option. By summer, perhaps 80,000 people had evacuated London, nearly a third of the population. King Charles II and his court relocated to Oxford. The wealthy merchants packed their families into coaches and headed for country estates. This exodus left London to the poor, the desperate, and the trapped. Those who remained faced impossible choices. Do you stay in the city and risk death, or do you try to flee, potentially carrying the plague to uninfected areas? If you stay, do you lock yourself inside and hope the plague passes by, or do you continue working to feed your family? If a family member falls ill, do you report it and accept quarantine, or do you try to hide it and risk spreading the disease? Consider the plight of the nurses, not medical professionals, but working-class women hired to care for plague victims. These women would enter quarantined houses to tend to the sick, often living there for the duration. It was dangerous work, frequently fatal. Many nurses survived by adopting a brutal pragmatism, stealing from the homes they entered, sometimes drinking themselves into stupors to cope with the horrors they witnessed. Some were accused of deliberately infecting people to create more work for themselves. Whether these accusations were true or simply reflected the paranoid atmosphere is impossible to know. But the fact that such accusations were made reveals the depth of social breakdown. The plague orders, the official regulations governing the city's response read like something from a dystopian novel. Households with sick members were to hang out wisps of straw for 40 days to warn others away. No public assemblies were allowed. Theaters were closed, as were taverns and alehouses. Even churches held limited services, and funerals were restricted to immediate family only. The authorities appointed examiners to root out infected houses and watchmen to guard them. Dogs and cats were slaughtered by the thousands, because they were believed to spread the plague. Unfortunate decision, as these animals actually helped control the rat population that truly did carry the fleas that spread the disease. The remedies and preventive measures ranged from the merely useless to the actively harmful. Physicians, those few who remained in the city rather than fleeing, recommended bloodletting, purging, and various toxic concoctions containing mercury, arsenic, or antimony. Quack doctors sold amulets, charms, and pills, promising immunity. One popular recipe involved catching a live toad, hanging it in a chimney until it died and dried out, then wearing it in a bag around your neck. Another suggested holding a live chicken against the buboes to draw out the poison, a treatment that occasionally worked, not because of any poison-drawing properties, but because the warmth might help the buboes burst and drain. The psychological strain manifested in different ways. Some people became hyper-religious, convinced the plague was divine punishment for sin. They spent hours in prayer, performed acts of charity, confessed past wrongdoings to neighbors. Extreme sects emerged, with self-proclaimed prophets wandering the streets predicting the end of days. One man stripped naked and ran through the city crying that the apocalypse had arrived, that London would be consumed by fire, a prophecy that would seem eerily prescient when the Great Fire struck just a year later. Others responded with hedonism. If death was inevitable, they reasoned, why not enjoy your final days? Some survivors reported seeing people drinking and carousing in taverns, deliberately flouting the restrictions, spending their last coins on wine and prostitutes. Kind of desperate nihilism took hold in certain quarters. We're all going to die anyway, so let's die drunk and happy rather than cowering in fear. The children suffered in ways that are particularly heartbreaking. Many were orphaned, their parents taken by plague within days of each other. These children would wander the streets, begging for food, sleeping in doorways. Some parishes attempted to care for them, but resources were stretched thin. Other children were locked up in quarantined houses with their dead parents, too young to understand why no one would open the door, why they were trapped with corpses. Contemporary accounts mention the cries of children from behind Red Cross doors, pleading for someone to let them out, to give them water, to take away their dead mother. These cries often went unanswered. To open that door was to risk infection. September brought the peak of death. The weekly bills of mortality recorded over 7,000 plague deaths some weeks, though the true number was certainly higher as many deaths went unreported. The city felt like it was bleeding out, life draining away week by week. And then, gradually, as autumn's cooler weather arrived, the death rate began to decline. By November, new cases were rare. By December, the plague had loosened its grip on London. But here's what we need to understand about the Great Plague. It wasn't just the physical death toll that devastated London. It was the death of trust, the death of community, the death of the social contract that holds civilization together. When the plague finally receded, Londoners had to reckon with what they had done to each other in the name of survival. Families had turned away their own relatives. A son had refused to shelter his infected mother. A husband had fled, leaving his wife and children to face the plague alone. Neighbors had informed on neighbors, sending them to imprisonment and likely death. Merchants had price gouged on food and medicine. Officials had taken bribes. Nurses had stolen from the dying. These weren't monsters, they were ordinary people making impossible choices under extraordinary pressure. But the guilt remained. The psychological scars ran deep. Many survivors suffered what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They startled at sudden noises, couldn't stop checking their bodies for swellings. They had nightmares about red crosses and plague pits. Some became obsessively clean, washing themselves repeatedly, unable to feel pure. Others fell into deep depressions, unable to see meaning in life after witnessing so much death. The trauma rippled through generations. Parents who had lost children to plague became overprotective of future children, passing down anxieties that shaped family dynamics for decades. The social fabric had to be rewoven, but the old patterns were broken. The wealthy who had fled returned to find their reputations tarnished. They had abandoned the city in its darkest hour. The poor who had stayed resented them. Class tensions, already present, intensified. The city that emerged from the plague was more fractured, more cynical, more aware of how quickly the veneer of civilization could crack. What the Great Plague revealed is something we still struggle with today, when faced with an invisible threat. When mortality becomes immediate and personal, we often react in ways that undermine our own humanity. Fear makes us cruel. Self-preservation makes us selfish. The instinct to survive can override the bonds that make us human. London's response to the plague, the quarantines, the enforced isolation, the breakdown of social trust, might have slowed the disease's spread, but it also created a different kind of death, the death of what it meant to be a community. And here's the truly unsettling part. We can't be certain we would behave differently. We like to think we're more enlightened now, more rational, more compassionate. But strip away modern medicine, place us in a situation where a cough might mean death, where touching a doorknob could kill our children, and would we be any better? The plague strips away our pretensions about human nature and shows us what we really are. Frightened animals trying desperately to survive, capable of both extraordinary compassion and terrible cruelty, often in the same breath. The irony is that many of the measures taken to fight the plague were counterproductive. Locking healthy people in with infected family members virtually guaranteed more deaths. Killing cats and dogs removed the natural predators of rats. The focus on miasma and bad air distracted from the real culprit, fleas on rats, carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. But we can't judge these responses too harshly. They didn't know about bacteria or vectors of disease transmission. They were operating with incomplete information, trying to fight an enemy they couldn't see or understand, making decisions based on fear and medieval medical theory. The Great Plague of 1665 killed between 75,000 and 100,000 Londoners, roughly a quarter of the population. But statistics don't capture the human experience. They don't tell you about Margaret the washerwoman, frantically scrubbing her doorstep with vinegar, or the child locked in with her dead mother's corpse, or the nurse stealing rings from dead fingers to feed her own starving children. They don't convey the smell of the plague pits, or the sound of the dead cart's bell echoing through empty streets at midnight. What survived, ultimately, was London itself. The city recovered. People returned, rebuilt, moved forward. Within a year, the Great Fire would sweep through, destroying much of the old city and perhaps burning away some of the pestilence with it. But the memory of the plague remained, encoded in nursery rhymes and folk memory. A reminder of what can happen when nature reminds us how fragile we really are. So would you survive a day in plague-ridden London? Maybe, if you were lucky, if you were wealthy enough to flee, if you were strong enough to resist infection, if you were ruthless enough to make hard choices. But the real question isn't whether you'd survive physically, it's whether you'd survive with your humanity intact. The Great Plague forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. When the stakes are life and death, when the threat is invisible and everywhere, we become different people. Some rise to extraordinary acts of courage: the nurses who stayed despite the danger, the parish officials who continued working, the family members who nursed their loved ones knowing they were likely condemning themselves to death. But others crumble, revealing selfishness and cruelty we'd prefer to believe we're not capable of. History remembers the Great Plague as a tragedy, a natural disaster that struck London in an unlucky year. But it was more than that. It was a stress test for human nature, and the results were mixed. Yes, there was horror and betrayal and social collapse. But there was also resilience, adaptation, and the stubborn human insistence on continuing despite overwhelming odds. When we sing Ring Around the Rosie today, we rarely think about its origins. We've sanitized the memory, transformed trauma into a children's game. Maybe that's necessary. Maybe we need to defang our nightmares to move forward. But occasionally it's worth remembering what those words really meant. The Rosie was the rash. The posies were the desperate attempt to ward off death. The ashes were the bodies burned to stop the spread. And we all fall down because, in the end, the plague took everyone it wanted, regardless of class or virtue, or desperate prayers. The Great Plague of 1665 is not just a historical curiosity, it's a mirror held up to human nature under pressure. It shows us what we're capable of, both terrible and sublime. It reminds us that civilization is more fragile than we like to admit, that the boundary between order and chaos is thinner than we'd prefer to believe, and that when that boundary breaks, we discover who we really are beneath the social masks we wear. London survived, its people survived, scarred but alive. They rebuilt, they remembered, and they passed down the story in their own ways. We inherit that story now, along with the question it poses. When the next crisis comes, and it will come, what will we do? Will we seal our neighbors behind Red Cross doors, or will we find a better way? Will fear make us cruel or compassionate? The plague is long gone, but the questions it raised about human nature and community and survival remain as urgent today as they were in 1665, and that, perhaps, is the most unsettling revelation of all. We all fall down, but we also get back up. How we choose to rise, that's what defines us.